Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 5 of the portrait painting course. In this lesson we're going to be talking about actually starting to paint the light and to render the image. What I want to start off with is a couple of very fundamental things, and specifically as I render and demo on this portrait, I want to talk and showcase those principles and fundamentals in action. But then as I go on, when I finish demoing on this particular portrait, I've also prepared a couple other ones. So I have a different scenario in here and another different scenario in there. And what I'll do is I'll do a time lapse with some narration over these, because a lot of the same principles are going to be used, but there's going to be a bit of a different focus based on each individual case. So I think that will be interesting. And it will also show a couple examples that are a little bit less generic than this one, but I opted to do this one in real time and demo it here because it's a very basic, generic sort of lighting scenario with a Rembrandt setup here, and I think that's the best way to show the most basic things. And so just as a sort of a preamble and a bit of a mindset or a thinking on rendering, I think a very good way to at least conceptualize working with light, but then also perhaps apply that in your process, is to always piece things apart and keep them separate and start with the most simple things and then go into more complexity, just as with everything else. But specifically in this case, the way that's done and the way that that's achieved is, as we've been talking about in the light blocking, is to always start with a single value for the shadows, especially if it's a direct light source. Then that makes the most sense. So start off with a single value. When you block it in, don't necessarily worry too much about specificity, about getting everything right. It's more so about getting the big idea and seeing if that works, if you like how it looks. And then also, don't necessarily worry too much about the edges of the terminators or any sort of transitions, because that is a more complex thing that will be added on top of this simplicity that we're starting off with. So I think for the first most important and most fundamental part of rendering, I really want to talk about the halftone and the edges of the terminator, which are closely tied to the halftones. So to start off with, there's really two main principles that I want to discuss. The first one being the fact that, and this is covered in some other classrooms as well, but I want to reiterate and I want to show how that specifically applies to painting portraits. The fact that your light in here, your halftone, and your shadow are all going to have distinctly different colors, and by that I mean obviously different values, but then also different hues and saturations. So if you pick out the sort of light value here, and this is a blown out photo, so it's not the best example, but you can still see this being the light, this being the halftone, which doesn't really show up too well, and then this being the core shadow. You can see how if you look at the color picker there, both the hue and the saturation shifts. So there isn't a huge change in hue in this specific example. There is a substantial change, as you can see, in saturation. So it's not as if, maybe even more fundamentally saying, it's not as if I'm taking the light and I'm just moving it down in value for a halftone, because you can see that is a distinctly different color, and then moving it down even further for a shadow. This looks very different. This sort of a change looks very different from what we have here, and that is because the shifting isn't only in value but also in hue and saturation. So that is very fundamental, and most people are probably aware of that, but it is very important to mention with portraits as well, and with the specific caveat also. And if you pick out the colors in here, which is also a good example, you see how if you look at them, and again look at the way that the color shifts in the box here, they're distinctly different, both in terms of like the well, these are kind of similar actually in terms of well, you can see them moving a little bit, and this is like also based on the color picker, like that, which kind of pixel it picks out. But if you look at them just visually, you can see that this is not just like a a flat out step down, but a more saturated version of this color. So even if they're fairly close, there is still some shift. For example, if you look at the saturation, there is a change, and then obviously in value here. So this image isn't really this specific part of it isn't really the best example, partially because of the way that it's photographed, but I have some other examples that show it pretty well. So I have the paintings, but I also have these photos. So I just want to color pick from these and just demonstrate again the way that the colors shift in all directions. So I think the nose here is a pretty good example. This would be the sort of color of the light right here. This is the color of the halftone. So here you can actually see it very clearly, and that's partially because the local value of this skin is lighter. You can see very clearly how large a jump is from the saturation here to here to here. So and also the hue changes slightly as well, and that will depend on what's going on in the shadows as well. So like this shift from the halftone to shadow might be more dramatic. Like if I pick out this shadow, that's more desaturated and more bluish. So there might be a different change depending on what's specifically going on in the shadows. In general, you will see distinctly different colors for the light, halftone, and the shadow. And let's pick out some colors in here as well. So this is the light. This is the halftone here. And again, a bit of an issue here is perhaps that I'm picking a point sample, where you should probably pick out like a middle in between. So if you look at these, the change isn't that large in terms of the hue, but the saturation definitely changes. So that is something to consider when looking at references. This is what comes out when you analyze them, when you actually go and color pick. But if you look at paintings, which are generally gonna have more richness, you can also see the same principle happening, and a lot of times, depending on what the artist's intentions were, even more pronounced. So let's say that this is the light color here, and I'll say that these are sort of perhaps something like this is a halftone. So anything from here to there is a halftone, and then you have the shadow right there, and it becomes even deeper right here. But now color picking these, you can also see the same pattern emerging, where it's not only the shift isn't only happening in value, but also in saturation, and then by extension in hue as well. So like this is if you pick this out, it's slightly more reddish. Let me pick out these ones as well, just to sort of showcase a similar thing. Like if you take the light here, the halftone here, and then the shadow, they're fairly similar, but there is still shifting going on. Specifically, there's some hue shifting happening. So both things can be true, and it's generally not going to be a huge shift because, as I'd mentioned previously, most of your skin colors are going to be within this range in natural light or neutral light, but it is a shift nonetheless. And if you look at something like this, which is way more exaggerated, this is a very yellow color, and some of these halftones start getting very red, and then the shadows are pretty red as well. But look at the dramatic shift that happens from this light portion here to the halftone, even like a less deep halftone there, and then going into a very deep halftone in here. That is a very dramatic shift, and then it goes. If you look at the hue specifically, from a very red to a very yellow. So that is a more exaggerated example based on the artist's aesthetic preferences, but it is showing, in a sense, it is echoing what is happening in reality, what is actually seen, taking it a step further. As I mentioned, and this applies to any object in light generally, you will have a different color of the light, the halftone, and the shadow. But specifically for skin, what you notice often is, almost in all cases really, and this is true with a lot of materials as well, but with skin specifically, you will see that the halftone is the most saturated. So it's more saturated than the light, because the light will tend to be very light, and light colors can't have that much saturation generally, and the shadow will tend to be very dark, so it can't hold that much saturation either. So then you're left with the saturation in between. And these aren't the best examples of another reason why that happens, but another reason why that happens is if you have a very strong light source, you we'll actually see some subsurface scattering, which will saturate the halftone even further, and it will make the halftone more red. It will tint it more warm, so that in this example, it will not. It might. Well, this is actually this one is probably the best example. In this example, you don't really see that reddening, but in this one you do, and that is partially because of the way that it's photographed, but it's also, for example, here, a very subtle subsurface scattering going on, so that the shift from this color here into a more red hue is more apparent. So I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind, a very fundamental thing to keep in mind, and specifically when you go to lay in your colors, as I'll go here. So that is the first thing, is you have to consider that as you block things in, your shadow and your halftone will differ in saturation, often in hue, and they will also be different in those terms from the light as well. So if I have this set up right now with a single color that is used for my shadows, it will logically be the most simple, the most simple way to achieve what I'm going for a more saturated halftone is to just take this color that I have on my multiply layer and drag it up and saturate it more, so that with that the halftone will be the base color that I have in the flat layer here, and it will be that color darker and more saturated, and that's what you see here as well. Is it's this color, just darker, more saturated, and more red. And this is not true in every single lighting scenario, obviously, but it's a good general rule of thumb to keep in mind. And again, as I mentioned, it is something that happens with most materials because of the values, but it also specifically is an effect that is perhaps in some scenarios seen more clearly in skin because of that subsurface scattering that I've talked about previously, and that happens, and that is the most visible as the light goes into shadow. Going back to this guy, if I want to get that halftone going, I'm just going to take this color, I'm going to lighten it, and I'm going to just tint it red. So perhaps something like this, maybe even lighter, is a good way to lay in my halftones. And then I can sort of choose, well, is this too much? How much variation do I actually want? How much subsurface scattering is, how much of it looks good, just based on my preference. So perhaps something like this would be good. And then in the beard area here, there's more desaturated. I would probably take a different approach, so I wouldn't necessarily have it so red. It would be a little bit more close. But I'm not just taking this color of the shadow and just laying it in, because that would be a very desaturated color. I'm actually taking a separate, completely different color that is more saturated and using that, and you can see that clearly in here. You can see the difference. So that is the first fundamental thing that I'm paying attention to, is just placing a more saturated, more warm color in general around the halftone, or around the terminator in the halftones, and then by extension, I can do that in some of the places where I know there will be deep halftones as well. So perhaps not as deep as there are around the terminator, but in some areas there will definitely be, there are planes that face more away from the light, so I can start laying in some of those transitions as well. But I'll more on that later, more on halftones. I think specifically in this process, you should focus on, after laying in the shadows with a single layer, then you should focus on blocking in the halftones and the specific color of the halftone. Then, sort of at the same level of importance, I think, is considering the quality of the terminator, or specifically the edge of the terminator. So a very simple way to look at this is, let's say I have a form like this. If my terminator, the edge between the light and the shadow, is more sharp, that will indicate a tighter corner, so that now the cross contour line on this, the surface, will look something like this. But if I make it more soft, and this is somewhat obvious, but it's a very important basic principle that you should keep in mind when laying things in. If I make it softer, that will indicate that the transition is more smooth. So this is something that's going to be very important for the face as you go to render it, and this will determine a lot of the form reads. So the quality of the Terminator, its sharpness, along with obviously the halftones in the light. But that is what I'm going to do next. And you can do this either way. Like you could keep one value in the block-in and do the edges first, and then add the halftones on top of that, or you can place the halftones in first and then create the edges of the Terminator. It's really up to you. I think they're at a similar level of importance, and both being very fundamental. So let's do that. And a good rule of thumb to keep here is in some in areas that are more there's obviously going to be a distinction, and your judgment will be made based on your understanding of the planes and how sharply the planes break. In a lot of cases on the face, the planes will break more sharply around the areas that are more bony. So this guy has a very bony face, just the likeness of it. But if he had more fat, for example, in the places where it's generally stored, such as in the cheeks, most often, and as a person ages around the chin here, there you would expect to find softer transitions, softer edges of the Terminator, whereas in the nose, where you really can't gain fat, there you would tend to find harsher, sharper transitions, because there's only bone and cartilage there, along with a layer of skin. So if I go in here and I want to create this effect, I'm just going to use a smudge brush, and you can go about this different ways, but I think this is just a simple way to show it. I can smudge the edge here on the cheek, and even though that's a bony part, it is still a softer or a more gradual transition compared to the edge here around the nose. And in this edge as well, I'll also sharpen things a little bit more, so maybe like that, but not as much. And in this wing around the nostril, I'll do a similar thing, but likewise I'll keep it a bit tighter, a bit more blocky. And so in the chin, I'm thinking this is a more broad form, so maybe in there I can also get a bit softer. Get that, and some softness in here. So I generally don't want completely sharp edges. It's just a matter of how soft they're gonna be, and unless you're stylizing very heavily, there's a layer of skin and subcutaneous fat on the face that will make every edge somewhat soft, apart from the cast shadows. So if you have a sharp, strong directional light source, the cast shadows will really be the only places where you will get a very strong, sharp edge between the light and the shadow. So that is very important, and that is one big thing that will carry the form radius. Apart from obviously having a hierarchy of softness, as I described around the Terminators, you also need to have all the Terminators necessarily softer than the cast shadows, because the cast shadows are they're being cast by a directional light source, and with that they're going to be sharp, especially at the places near the place that the object that's casting, whereas the form shadows are on a soft, flashy, organic surface, so they're going to be softer because of that. And now I can just go around here and really do a very similar thing throughout, which is try to figure out perhaps more specifically where the shadows might be. So maybe I misplaced some of the shadows. So as I go and add my my halftones around the Terminators, and perhaps start adding some deeper halftones around the face, I'll also constantly reconsider the decisions that I already made. Like, are these shadow shapes good? Are there any places here that would be more in shadow? Any places that would not be in shadow? So I'm still not fixated, and I can still change things around if need be. So I'm being critical about what I already have placed in here. So maybe this cast shadow isn't really that good, and I can do this with more or less care in the very block-in, and then maybe change it later if I wasn't careful enough. But specifically in the ear here, I'm not exactly sure if this is too accurate, but I'll leave it as it is for now. I think all of this would be in light though, and there would just be halftones. So I'm still trying to mostly focusing on things that would be fully in shadow. And then as well, I could go in here and really tighten up the halftones around the parts that are not the portrait itself. But I'm not gonna focus in on that necessarily now. I'll probably finish this up in the time lapse. So just to recap, the general process could have a. This distracted me now, but I could have, as I was talking about in the material portion, I could have a form shadow in the on the eyeball there and a cast shadow here. So I think I'll refine this a little bit better off screen. But to recap again, what we have or sort of the process that I have laid out so far is to start off with a simple one value, one color shadow and light blocking. So there's the flat colors for the underlying thing that might as well, if you're doing a different process, might as well could have been just a single value like this. And then there was only one value for the shadow that is completely grouped. And then I figured out the another really only one single color for the halftones, and I've added that throughout. In some places more so than others. And then I went in and did some transitions to figure out the form reads better, or specifically around the Terminator. So that is really as far as I've gotten right at this stage. And if you look at it, if you look at the portrait with no local colors, you can actually see quite nicely the nice transitions and changes between light, shadow, and halftone. And then as I go in further now, there's two things that I want to focus on. One of them being the subsurface scattering, a bit more, working out the subsurface scattering a bit more, and the other one being working on the halftones. So let's get rid of this, because I can have a better view of what's actually going on visually with my local colors. And I want to start off with specifically adding some subsurface scattering. So I'll color pick the halftone, but maybe I'll make it a little bit more intense. Add some subsurface scattering around the cast shadows, because you will have a strong contrast between light and shadow in that area, and that will often cause the light that's bouncing into the skin to seep out into the shadow. So that is why often in direct sunlight you will get a saturated edge around cast shadows. So I just want to do that here, perhaps a bit of it here, but not so much in the mustache area, because the skin is being obstructed by the hairs there. So that's one thing, and pretty simple thing as well. Maybe some of it in here. So I want to be fairly discreet with, I don't want to overkill it. And obviously in this cast shadow as well, I'll add that. Okay, some of it I can start adding into the shadows as well. So as the light bounces around, perhaps this crevice, I can get a more saturated color. So I just took the shadow color and I tinted it towards a more saturated reddish color, and I'm adding that in here. So it can be fairly subtle, as I've done. Like it's not a crazy change, but it does add a nice richness. Perhaps some of it under the nose there, and then definitely you see this a lot in the ears. So I'll add some of it pretty loosely there also, maybe even underneath here. So that is the first thing that I've done, is I've now started working in the subsurface scattering, and then I'll start really tightening up the halftones. So what I'll do is I'll just pick the halftone that I have already, and I'll start glazing it in and getting some better value relationships. So one thing that is pretty obvious that I should do is, as this whole face form rolls away, I think it makes sense to darken this plane. So this plane is facing more away from the light than this one. I think I can darken that, and then I'll start sort of again thinking abstractly about what's going on with my face. What are the actual forms there, and how do they relate to the light source? Like where the light source is coming from specifically. And another thing again to note is I can still edit the shapes that I have for the shadows. I'm not that set on everything. I might notice later that something's off, and I would prefer to change it rather than just like stick with it. It's definitely better to throughout the whole process stay critical. So really, what I'm going to be thinking about here is what are the based on the light source specifically that I have, it's going to be what are the planes that are facing more down and more away from the light. So, and a good way to do this is to start very big, just as with the shadow blocking. So maybe I'll do a whole wash in here, or like a big surface. This whole actually side plane of the face that might be facing a little bit more down, and then specifically with the cheek form, I might get the arch of the cheekbone facing a bit more down as well. So I'm starting to lay that in with the ear as well. I'm thinking which forms are facing away, which forms are going down and rolling off. So maybe something like this might work. And then on the neck as well, around the cast shadow here, I might start laying in the halftones as well, and the whole neck perhaps, because it is pretty much vertical, or the planes are. It might be a bit darker than the cheek because the upper plane of the cheek is facing a little bit more up than the neck here. So I'm thinking about their relationships really as I'm laying this in, and specifically about what is facing away, because I'll add another layer of lightening on things that are facing the most towards the light. So in here, I think I can make this brow ridge form very thick. So maybe that's facing away a little bit more, and I can start going into some wrinkles if I like, or I can leave this for later. But I think this is a good start, and then maybe on the hair as well, I can start adding some better diffuse halftones. So there's no reflections yet on anything at all, including the hair. It's really just the same. And I'm also using a more saturated color for the halftone of the hair to add some nice color variety as well. And then in the color here, I can also start adding some halftones. Maybe start indicating some folds. But again, that's not really what this lesson is about. So this is as far as I've gone now, without having merged any of the layers. I laid in the edges of the shadows, and most of the halftones. And the next step now is to lay in some center lights, and the center light really is just the plane that is facing the most towards the light. And in this case, since the light is sort of at a 45-degree angle, both from the top and from the side, perhaps the things that would be the most in light are these areas here. So the forehead that is actually covered up by hair, sadly, and this, which is also covered up by hair, and then some of this like side plane of the nose, or like the transition from the side plane to the top plane, and the side plane a little bit more than the top plane, I think, perhaps. But I can lay this in, see how it looks, and then judge from there. So just as I talked about the halftone being a specific different color, the light will also be a different color, and that will be reflected with just selecting something that's not completely white. Because if I use the white here, and I'm using a soft light, you can use a screen, it really doesn't matter. But if I select the white, that will just add the color without tinting the hue. And I want to change the saturation, the hue, and the value being the most obvious thing that changes. So maybe I'll select something like this, which is like slightly yellow, because it's a warm light source, let's say, and then I'll just add a little bit of that in some areas that I think might receive a little bit more of that light, but it's very subtle. And I think a lot of this form will be carried a bit more by adding the reflections, which is going to come really after I'm completely satisfied with my diffuse light. So I think even only something like this is pretty good for a start for the diffuse lighting, and specifically, like, there aren't, as I've mentioned, too many planes here, too many surfaces that are really facing towards the light that much, so I can't really do too much with the light here. I'm trying to stay objective and think about the light abstractly. So I'll say that this is fairly done in terms of the the matte rendering, which just concerns itself with the form, the light on the form, and not the reflections. And then I think it's time to start going into reflections, and with that I'll punch out and pop out the form more, the form of the skin, and I'll also start showing a lot of the material a lot better, specifically the hair here when I add the reflections on it, but also the eyes and some of the skin as well, although a big element of the believability of skin and something feeling like flesh is, as I've mentioned, just having that subsurface scattering, which I've added already. Before I get into the reflections though, I think it will also be a good idea to start adding some of the modeling factors within the shadows. So if you look at the elements of form, really, you see that there's, within light, there's really the sort of highlight or center light, the midtone and the halftone being just like the deepest parts in light, the darkest parts in light. And then within the shadow, you have a core shadow, which is really just a result of parts that are not hit by reflected light. And then if you had elements that are up close to each other or that overhang, you would also get ambient occlusion. So that is what I want to add now. I want to add the reflected light and the ambient occlusion inside of the shadows here, obviously. And then when I add that, I'll be ready to go into reflections. So let's just do that on the same layer as well, because I don't feel like having too many layers. For the ambient occlusion, I'll simply just lower the value here and add some darker surfaces, or more so gradients, because ambient occlusion generally is more of a gradient from the crevices. So maybe some of it could be in the hair here, perhaps here you might get some deeper shadow. And one good thing to start doing now at this point, where a lot of the modeling factors are blocked in already, is to lower the opacity of the line art. So I'll put that on multiply. I'll also colorize it, so I'll add some saturation to it. Maybe this sort of a brownish color works nice, and I'll lighten it even more. So now, instead of the lines holding everything together, I'll try and start having the ambient occlusion hold the place of lines, because a lot of times the lines are kind of like the ambient occlusion. So in here, like the lines for the nostrils really are just showing that there's a deep ambient occluded shadow there. So I can start adding that. I can start adding some of that ambient occlusion below the lids here, because that's really another thing that happens. So maybe some of that in there, a little bit in here, even in the places they're not. Whoops, this is the wrong. Whoa, I'm using the wrong layer. Whoops. Doesn't matter. I'll go back here and I'll restart it. So let's just go in here. And that's why I don't want to have too many layers, is because it's a bit of a mess. But let's go back. Again, add that on the lid there. And not only in shadow, so not only in these places that are in shadow, but also in this light, there will also be an ambient occlusion gradiating from the bottom lid here. So that might look something like this. And within the shadows, I can add some deeper occlusions as well, like where the lids overlap, stuff like that. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Maybe a bit of ambient occlusion in here, and then also I can start adding reflected light. So I still wanna be fairly grouped here, and I can think about reflected light really in two ways. I can sort of fake it and say that something off screen is reflecting or filling in the shadows, or I can have it a little bit more realistic. So I can be like, the objects that are within the canvas are reflecting. So perhaps this skin that is in light might reflect some more orange saturated light beneath here. That might be something that could look cool. But then apart from that, in these areas, I wouldn't really have anything on screen that would reflect. So maybe I'll add like just a bit of a cooler plane in here. It's really not a big change, but as I mentioned, I wanna stay very grouped, so I don't lose the big wreath that I had set up so arduously throughout the process. So maybe something like this is good enough. And in this example, it's really kind of like the background is filling in the light in here. So I kind of took the gray of the background and put it in there. And this gives me a bit of a stronger Terminator, and I can make that even stronger if I like. If I want to have an even stronger form pop, I can add a bit of a darker Terminator around here. So let's say I want to do that. Let's do it like that. Okay, so now really is the point where I have my and I want to look at this again, but now's the point where I have my diffuse lighting set up. I just lowered the bounce light here because it's a bit too much, but at this point I can start adding the reflections. I can feel confident with that, so I think I'll just do it on another layer. It's going to be a screen layer just because reflections are lighter, and I'll use something like a yellowish color as well. So they're also going to be a distinctly different color from both the light, the halftone, and the shadow, but in a lot of cases the reflections are so light that it's not really important what hue you use, because they're just going to go almost white. So like something like this, a desaturated yellow, works well enough. So I'll just use that. And I'll just place it in the points where I think reflection might happen, but I also have a fairly good idea of, in general, where the reflections tend to happen on the face. So that is a helpful thing to have inside of your visual library. So the lid here might catch a bit of a reflection, and the nose definitely is the strongest one, and maybe the nostril might or might not have a bit of a reflection. I'll see about that. And the nose here might have it a little bit more centrally at this point, and then on the transition of the top and the side plane here, like that. And then the lips would have a stronger transition, or a stronger reflection still, like that. Maybe the upper lip would get a bit of a highlight at the edge there, like that. A good idea as well is if for example you're doing reflections on the lips, you might want to make them a little bit redder so that they don't feel too off. So maybe something like this. And with the skin, you would want to keep them a little bit more beige to fit in with the actual local color. And then obviously the eyes, gonna need a pretty strong reflection there. Maybe another one. Sort of, and it's useful to have reference for this, but generally you'll see a sort of a reflection on the other side of the eye there as well. So perhaps something like this. This needs to be a little bit higher because it is reflecting the actual light source, and the light source is coming from top side. So something like this I think is good. And then maybe I can have a reflection for the forehead right here. That could look pretty good as well. And maybe I want to spread it out a little bit more. And then as I've mentioned in the material portion, the scars could be a bit more reflective also, so maybe they can get some light in there like that. Maybe in here as well. It's a little bit gross, but I think it works well. So something like that. And maybe even in here, some smaller reflections could be caught, like so. And then the ears will tend to be fairly greasy as well, so they might start catching some reflections. Perhaps up here, maybe up there, maybe a couple in here. And I think this is fairly good for the reflection portion, for the face specifically. And then with the hair, I want to use a bit more of a brown color to make the reflection tint a little bit more strongly towards the actual local color of the hair. This is just a material property that tends to happen. So I'm using a lasso tool here to keep the shape contained and fairly tight. And it's just a bit more quick this way. And then I'll just fill that in. So I have something to start off with, and then maybe these need to be a little bit less wide. And they're obviously also wouldn't be so so sharp. So I can start looking into having some more transitions, and I can also question myself again and ask whether this is really a good place, or maybe I can move the reflection to make a little bit more sense with the actual direction of the light source. So I think something like this is actually quite a bit more accurate and believable. And then I can also ask myself specifically like how clean or slick the hair is. So I feel like this reflection is a little bit too strong. The hair feels a little bit too clean, but something like this I think works better. And then I can also add it on in some of these more wild parts. And one thing that I've forgot to do is I can also add some occlusion shadows there as well. So like in between the clumps of hair, it would help with the reed to have some deeper shadows as well. Although I would probably do this a little bit more carefully if I was really to take my time with it. So something like that I think is good, just sort of to show the effect. And with the shorter hair, the more messy hair, you'll get less of this really strong reflection because it's less of a sheet like you have here. This feels a lot more like a sheet, and it's a lot more straight, and it has a larger surface to reflect, whereas here it's a lot more messy, less uniform. So you might get some stray parts with some reflections, but it's going to be a lot less unified. And then perhaps as the surface of the hair ripples here, you might get some other reflections, not only on this side, but repeating depending on what the angle of it is. And at this point, really, although I've kind of rushed some parts just because it would become redundant, I have a pretty good base for starting a render. I can still change some things a little bit. Maybe I can darken the whole light portion a little bit. That feels a little bit better. So I've just darkened the local values. And then as I go into rendering this, I'll clean everything up. I'll tidy up the halftones, and I'll really bring the believability up. But what I've done so far is place everything in the general position where I want it, and then I find it personally easier to edit things a little bit better and obviously model form when I actually paint directly. And one thing that I also want to sort of mention before I go into rendering is that I won't really I'll keep the reflections separate all the way until the end. So I'll merge everything. Right now I'll actually go in and merge my shadows, merge my diffuse lights in here, and I'll also merge my line art so I can start getting rid of it and painting over it. But I will not merge my reflections because they're just going to be distracting. Since thinking about rendering diffuse light, form light, and thinking about rendering reflections are two completely different logics. I want to separate them in this physical sense of layers as well, so that I don't confuse myself and so that I don't have too many things to think about at the same time.
Alright, so here is the sped up process for 3 different variations of this portrait lit in different ways. And with each of these, I just want to sort of give a little bit of insight and talk a bit about what are the things that I focused on the most, and kind of call out things as they happen. So with this more generic first one, this kind of Rembrandt light, the biggest thing I think that was really happening, because the most surface is in light, was rendering the halftones. And as with any painting going from line art into actual painting, the initial stage was a lot about just getting rid of the lines and painting over them. But then as I start actually rendering things, a big sort of problem that I was tackling is getting the halftones exactly right and moving them in such a way that they show form. And with that, really the biggest thing to focus on is to try to abstract things and think about the big surfaces. Here with the eye, what I did is I had to remove the strand because I had painted or drew that in, and it was sort of distracting me from painting. So I just got rid of it, and then I'll paint it in again later. And that's a big thing to keep in mind as well, is that as you get into painting, your drawing is never going to be perfect, and you're going to have to tweak some things. And if there's things that distract or make it more difficult to render, then it makes sense, obviously, to just get rid of them and either have them on a separate layer or add them in later. So in here, I'm really just... one other thing that I'm focusing on as well is getting some nice bounce light in the shadows, because that's gonna show my my material well. If I have some warm bounce light, especially there under the nose, from that sort of cheek portion bouncing into the nose, that's gonna work very well. And in general, with skin in this sort of a basic light with no strong temperature to it, it's a good idea to have some more warmth going around, some accents, and that's gonna sort of feel like subsurface scattering as well. So in here, again, it's really just a bunch of going around and adding some subtleties to the halftone, and if you'll notice, there's really no speculars and no reflections yet. I'm just figuring out the base render before I get into that, and that is really a very good idea to keep in mind. And you'll notice as well that I have a separate layer for the reflections that I'll get into later. This whole recording of the rendering portion is about an hour and 15 minutes, and I sped it up by 5 times. So I think that's sort of a good sweet spot where it's not necessarily like extremely quick, where you don't really get to see anything, but it's also not like drudging or way too slow in that sense. So and as I'd already mentioned, the halftone issue is something that I started tackling on very early, but there's also the issue of having correct terminators as well. So I have to make sure that my nose, for example, is the edge between the light and the shadow there is soft enough to feel like the actual proper form. And I'll be liquefying a little bit as well, because my drawing really isn't that perfect, and I want to change some likeness things in some cases as well. And another thing that's kind of useful to mention here is that I keep using the revert function. So if you go into I think it's under File, and then you just have Revert, and what that does is it shows you the previous version of the image before you, or the last time that you saved it, and that's very useful because, in general, when rendering, because when you get into details and when you get into really showing forms and subtleties, you get lost in that, and having something to call your attention back to what it looked like previously, and to have the ability to reference that and to compare and see if you messed something up is very, very useful. So I think that's just something in general, to either save a previous version of your image or to use the revert function as much as you need it, and that means fairly often, especially as you make fairly large changes. It's really helpful to just keep checking back and seeing, just like I did there, to see if something is off with that. So at this point, I'm sort of again going around some smaller portions as well, and figuring those out as well. So you'll see me get fairly up close and start rendering there, but then I'll always zoom out again and try to either do the revert function or just see the whole image at once. So I changed the cheek form a little bit with a multiply layer, and that's another helpful tip I think, is to use adjustment layers as well, because sometimes if you want to darken a big plane or a big portion, or create some sort of a gradient over top everything, it's a bit more difficult to use it with a normal layer or just flat painting that in. So what I generally do is I either use a soft light for lightening things or a multiply for darkening things. But you can also use a screen layer, or even an overlay, but with that you need to be careful not to overly saturate things. Now at this further cheek portion, I really want to make sure that the form is rounding and that it's darkening compared to the closer cheek. But here, again, it's just a bunch of smaller forms. Checking back again, see if I'm messing something up. And a lot of sort of, maybe not an issue, but a lot of what I was tackling as well is the beard portion. I wanted to make sure that the shape is right and that it feels like a 5 o'clock shadow. So if you look at the way that the image reverts, I also changed the likeness a bit, and so that is also another thing to keep in mind. Is obviously I'm changing the rendering, so I want to look back at that and see if it's progressing in the right direction. But I also want to look back at my likeness, at the actual design that I'm making, and see if that feels correct as well, because it might have felt better previously. So here I'm trying out some different scars, and I think I end up getting rid of some of these. I think I don't keep all of them. And when I go to add that strand of hair that was over the eye, I'll do that on a separate layer so I can manipulate it more easily. And that was just a thing that I couldn't really foresee that well, because I just drew the drawing and didn't think about how I was going to render the eye. And in here, another thing to mention as well that could be helpful is that I actually had quite a bit of reference. I had a couple reference images, and the way I classified those are sort of for the light. So some that would help me with the light patterns to make those more believable, and I would always have to sort of think in 2 dimensions, both looking at the reference and getting information and gathering stuff from there, but also thinking about what my planes are abstractly and trying to change the reference based on that. So I would have reference for the actual light, and then also reference for some of the likeness, because those are kind of separate things, and different likenesses will obviously generate different light patterns, but they're going to have a through line that's the same. And a little bit before, I had added some color variation, so that's another helpful thing to keep in mind as you go into rendering, is that if you keep color picking all the time, you might end up with colors that become more dull, because you're just taking colors that you already have, and as they mix, they might even become more desaturated, and so they might become weaker. So every so often in the rendering process, it's actually helpful to try to add some new colors, just like I added some warm bounce light there. So in the shadows, really, I'm thinking about 2 things. Is I have a warm bounce light coming from below. That was sort of one idea, and then the other one is that I have a fill light from that gray background coming into the cheek in the shadow on that side. But yeah, as I'd mentioned, I specifically did that on the beard portion. The added some clear greens and blues there, but I could have done it in some other areas as well. And I think I'll probably go into that image, actually into all of these images, and just do a bit of texturing on top, and probably add some more random color with that. So you saw there when I was adjusting the shape of that beard, I actually just added another layer because I wasn't certain what I'm going to go with. And I'm also adjusting the shape of the jaw. So even this far into the rendering, where it's nearly getting into the stage where I'll start adding highlights, I'm still changing some of the likeness, changing some aspects, and still just considering things critically. So I'm not just like going over everything. And in the neck here specifically, I wanted to add some warm halftones, and I struggled a little bit there. Changed things a little bit, but I think it ended up well enough. And I added some maybe a warmer local color on the back of the neck, because that tends to happen, or maybe you can just read it as a halftone to round out the neck. And only at this stage do I really start kind of more clearly figuring out this jaw area in terms of the big planes. And I think it turned out more solid because I started thinking that way a little bit more intentionally. But notice as well that even with these smaller changes that I'm making, because I'm getting pretty far into the render, I'm still reverting back to the previous version. Especially, actually, it might especially be useful in this stage, because you're adding more details and you might start drowning things out. So if I notice that I'm overkilling things and that I'm making things too stale and adding too much detail in some area, then I might just either go back to a previous version. So maybe I'll undo, or maybe I'll just paint that over and get rid of like excess. So I'm trying to push out the nose here. I added some occlusion shadows and some of that fill light. So I'm working in the shadows as well as in the lights, but in this specific image, the focus was more so on the light and on the halftones there, just because more of the image was in light. And so at this stage, this is a lot of just very refinement sort of stuff. I'm also, because I have everything set up, I'm also softening things a little bit as well to get a bit more of a skin-like texture. And I'm still adding some deeper halftones with the multiply, trying to round things out a little bit more. And that is, with halftones specifically, like a push and pull, where you want to slowly sort of move into depth and not go too crazy with the contrast in the halftones, because you want to group the lights and the shadows. So it's actually, I think, better to start adding the deeper halftones at the very end if you feel you need them, rather than overkill the contrast and sort of have to pull it back. And again, I'm just reverting a whole bunch and zooming out a lot as well. You'll notice that I zoom out very far. Even though I'm working on these small details, it's still about the far read. So you should not only just zoom out to like 100% where you see everything, but also zoom out to where the image is almost a thumbnail, to see like the big read. I'm also desaturating a little bit of the nose as well. So sometimes I'll actually use either a color layer or actually a saturation layer, because sometimes I'll know that I actually want to desaturate something. So I don't want to change the hue, so I can just use a saturation layer. So it's always based on, the layer mode that you use is always based on the intention that you want to achieve. But only at this point am I turning on the reflections layer there. It's a screen layer, so I can get some stronger reflections, specifically in the eyes and in the also in the hair. But I pulled those back a little bit. So, and I think I pulled all of the reflections back. I had laid them in pretty rough, but now I'm actually lowering the contrast and also softening the edges as well, because it is skin, so it's not going to be extremely glossy. And this is very important, is your base lock-in establishes an overall read, but now as you get into rendering, you really have to zero in on what you want. And what I wanted here is, for the hair, for example, I darkened the highlights, but I also saturated them more. I felt that worked well. And I had moved at the very beginning, before I merged the layer, I had moved the highlights specifically on the forehead there. And so all throughout the whole process, you have to stay vigilant and to stay sort of critical, and to think about what's working and what's not, and to not be afraid to change images up until the very end. And even when it comes to smaller, like more mundane choices like highlights, to still actively think about them and stay focused throughout. So it's not only about adding detail, it's really about thinking about how the whole image reads, and reconsidering everything as you go along and as you add more render fidelity. So that's really about everything for this image. I really wanted to zero in on the position of those strands, because I didn't want to have them distract too much, so I ended up moving the strand quite far left. But that's really the whole process that I have filmed for the first guy, but what I'll do is I'll probably touch them all up, as I mentioned, and I'll go in and actually record a little ending there to show you what they ended up with, or what I ended up with when I really, polish the materials up, and also when I go and add some, like, I don't know, atmospheric effects, perhaps, and things like that. For the assignment of lesson 5, you're gonna go into fully rendering a selected light blocking that you had done for lesson 4, and this might seem daunting at first, but I have done the full time-lapse video, so hopefully that gives you a better idea of the process of rendering. But just to reiterate, you have to separate this into parts or blocks, and not take all of the rendering elements at once. And by that I mean you would start off with what you had done in lesson 4, with blocking in just the flat shapes of the shadows, and then for the start of this assignment you would lay in a separate color for the halftone, usually something more saturated if we're talking about skin, and you would do that for each material. So you would have a separate color of halftone for hair, maybe for the fur, or whatever kind of materials you have on the portrait as well, and materials within the portrait also. And then you would start figuring out the edge of the terminator. So you would just lay in the separate color for halftone, and then you would see how soft the actual edge between the light and the shadow ought to be. So this is something that I discussed as well. And then when you merge all of the layers and start painting on everything, you would begin tackling the matte rendering at first, which means disregarding the specular highlights and any reflections that might exist. So you're just sort of rendering this as a completely non-reflective material, even though it's not really, it's skin. And then right at the very end, when you start getting into finesse, you would actually lay in your specular highlights, and that way you have a roadmap of edible sort of bite-sized chunks that you can hopefully take on one at a time and come out with something that looks like a high-fidelity render. So that's really the assignment for this lesson. Try to take this one as far as you can in terms of rendering. This is really the assignment that's going to take up most of your time and energy. Some of the other ones were a little bit quicker, but this is really the one where you gotta sink your teeth in. And then for the next 2 lessons, you're also going to be rendering, but not necessarily to a completely detailed finish as you ought to do in here. So good luck and have fun.